Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum, peace of God be upon you all. This is our fourth session entitled The Policies of Arab Gulf States Towards Political Changes in the Fertile Crescent. Why is this topic important? Obviously, it's because it's related to the role of the Gulf states, specifically when it comes to economy and also how they impact events in the region. In this framework, we have three speakers today, the first of which is Dr. Mohammed al-Misfer. Dr. Mohammed al-Misfer is a professor of political science at Qatar University. He's a regular columnist for both Doha-based and Pan-Arab newspapers and writes widely on Arab nationalism and related issues. And his contribution is widely praised. He earned his PhD from the University of New York in the United States of America. He has the floor, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be talking about ISIL, the Gulf, and the international coalition. In my paper, I am not going to tackle how these extremist religious groups came to light, and I am not going to tackle either how ISIL was established or even its purposes and its objectives. I believe that this was widely discussed yesterday. So I will focus on ISIL or Daesh and the international coalition. We know that the United States of America can mobilize countries in order to achieve its purposes in different circumstances, whether on the short or on the long term. So the US used mobilization in all its global wars in the last century. It is still doing that in the 21st century. It's well, actually, since it started until this very day, whether it was against the Soviet Union before its fall, or against the left-wing currents and movements which led eventually to the fall of the Soviet Union, mobilizing also countries against Taliban movement in Afghanistan, global mobilization against Al-Qaeda under the title and the credo fighting terror, and also mobilizing countries against Iraq until its occupation. Now, in 2014, the US is mobilizing more than 50 countries until now against ISIL, including, so among these countries, some Arab countries, if not all of them, secretly. The US administration and its Western allies confirmed that this war against ISIL will last probably 10 to 15 years, which means that it will only drain tons and tons of money. We know, and the US said by many spokespeople actually, said that the US cannot shoulder alone the costs of this war against ISIL. This means that other stakeholders are going to be shouldering this cost. We mean by that countries that can afford it, specifically the Gulf states. The Gulf states were used to finance the majority of American wars, if not all of them, in Afghanistan, and Iraq, and other countries as well. Furthermore, the reconstruction after these wars, whether in Afghanistan or in Iraq, was also financed by Gulf states. This did not lead, to the reconstruction neither of Afghanistan nor of Iraq, which means that we are the losers first and foremost. Media were actually underscoring this danger that is ISIL, a threat against the world, the Middle East, the US, and Europe. Many people, of course, sympathized, and mobilization skyrocketed really under this title or this slogan. In my opinion, the Gulf states were not and will not be the target of ISIL. Let's look at the environment where these extremist Islamic groups saw the light. These environments actually suffer from confessionalism, poverty, oppression, violations of human dignity. And I can say that the GCC countries are actually immune. They are not endangered, and they cannot be targeted by these groups. Now, some would actually refer you to what's happening in the east of Saudi Arabia, or probably attacks against an American in the streets of Riyadh. So this is really only a preamble or an omen of such a phenomenon, but no investigations showed so far why this happened. In my opinion, this is only an attempt to have this crisis echoing also in the Gulf, so that we say, yes, you are targeted as well. Let's look at the way GCC countries responded to the American invite to take part in the global coalition against ISIL. The question that should be raised here is the following. The GCC countries agreed to take part in the coalition, but was this willingly or in order really to protect themselves? I believe it's a bit of all. Items. I believe that some countries agreed to take part in this coalition not because they want to fight any Islamic organizations or groups, although many of these regimes stood against Islamic and Islamist groups specifically, but simply because they want to fight other groups. They're targeting other groups. So you wouldn't want to see the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, take arms. I refer you also to a reform process in reform movement in Yemen, and also Hamas in Palestine. I think that Gulf states also are not in agreement amongst themselves when it comes to different issues, whether economic, social, political, or otherwise. The evidence is that 4 ambassadors actually withdrawn from a capital that is part of the GCC and did not back until this very day. So clearly, issues are still very controversial. Another aspect is that when you take part in this coalition, this would hinder your sovereignty, the sovereignty of the country, because the sovereignty is that of the people at the end of the day. The US and Europe did not fight such Islamic movements, but after approval and green light from the respective parliaments and civil society in these countries. We asked the question here, did Gulf states refer to the public opinion or to parliaments in order to seek green light? Well, we can probably mention here the example of Kuwait, because there is parliamentary life and a process there. In general, Gulf states did not put this issue on the table, did not ask or seek the opinion of the elite and the leaders when it comes to mobilizing against ISIL. Now, what are the American goals and objectives? Obviously, it would be to consecrate even further the principles of confessionalism and sectarianism and different ethnicities. And I believe that the next stage would be Egypt. Maybe not now, but in the future. In the last 5 or 10 years, we hear schools focusing on this issue of Egypt, saying that Egypt was in Nubi first and foremost. So they were shedding light on this cultural or ethnic aspect of Egypt. Although this takes us back to years and years. Some say that Egypt is Coptic. Some say that Egypt is Sunni. So I believe that Egypt is going to fall in the footsteps of Lebanon and of Iraq as well. Now, the American objective, among the American objectives, is also to terrorize, to intimidate Gulf states, and to say that you are endangered as well. So that's why you have to be immune. You have to take part in this coalition in order to protect yourselves, protect your sovereignty. So really, the Arab leaders were terrorized as if a danger is coming their way, and they cannot fight that danger unless they take part in this coalition. Unfortunately, when Iraq was occupied in 2003, the Gulf states were exploited, were used, namely by the US, and the Gulf states were actually forced to acknowledging the ruling council back then, although it didn't deserve any legitimacy, simply because it was the fruit of the occupation and it goes against all international and global resolutions. Anyway, the GCC was used in order to legitimize this council ruling Iraq back then, and we cannot but mention here that the charter of the Arab League states clearly that membership is that of independent sovereign states. The same applies to the UN charter. Mobilization, global mobilization, was used in order to acknowledge a regime put together by an occupier and by a government that was appointed by the United States of America. Among the objectives also of the US is to weaken the political and economic impact or influence of Arab states. Richard Hess, who's in charge of planning the State Department and who was behind the project of really exporting democracy to the Arab region, even by force, says that the West is really concerned with the increase of wealth in the Gulf states because they would have greater impact on the US economy and on the global economy in general. Henry Kissinger as well and Dr. Martin Feldstein, who's a professor of economy at Harvard University, also warned the US administration and the West in general from this accumulation of millions and billions of dollars because of the sale of Arab oil, obviously, and trust funds as well. So they are inviting the West to reduce such wealth because eventually they will turn into a political impact as well. So, in order to limit the impact of such wealth, you need wars in our Arab region, which means that our countries will start the raids to buy weapons and will participate in terms of financing other stakeholders' wars. Burden Lewis says that Arabs and Muslims in general are corrupt and they are chaotic and they will never be civilized. And in his opinion, the right way to deal with Arabs is simply to recolonize them and to reoccupy them and to undermine their religious culture as well as its social repercussions. He also says that it is necessary to redivide the Arab and Islamic region. He says it is important to divide these states into confessional and tribal units. So the US, he says, should put pressure on Arab leaders harshly and persistently in order to take the peoples of this region away from Islamic beliefs. Also, more pressure should put on these people and the racial, confessional, tribal tensions should be exploited. So here comes the major question. Our leaders, are they aware that they are in danger before everybody else? Because our peoples would eventually live together, and these elites and these governments have no way out, have no way to salvation but working with the peoples, working with the citizens. This is their only way to salvation. Finally, how can we immunize our Gulf states? I believe that this should happen. So immunity should happen through further justice and equality among citizens, and also kickstarting administrative, political, and economic reforms, also dealing with the reasons that led to extremism. I mean by that, poverty, ignorance, oppression, corruption, and all its aspects, in all its fields, and also putting an end to the really dependence and allegiance to any foreign power, and also not accepting the Zionist project in the region, specifically in Palestine, and also respecting freedom of expression and ensuring political participation of the people. Also seeking sustainable development, dependent judiciary, because a judiciary is the foundation of a ruling. And one last word I would like to say from this podium here, the following. A few days ago in social media and also in some newspapers that are published outside the Gulf, it is said that I am the first among Arab intellectuals, and by the way, this is an accusation that I find very a source of pride. It was said that I'm the first university professor to support Daesh or ISIL. And please allow me to correct that. I do not support any religious party, regardless of their beliefs. I am not supporting any religious party. However, when it comes to Sunni movements that are fighting today this oppression, I say that dialogue is necessary with these organizations specifically. This is something that God, the Almighty, asks us to do, because God also started a dialogue with Satan. This is in the Quran. So why can't we talk to these groups? Why don't we start a dialogue in order to protect our region? This is something that I wanted to mention so that no words are put in my mouth. I was really accused of many things, of supporting Bashar al-Assad, of humiliating the Libyan people, and these are things that I actually clarified in Al-Quds newspaper before. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Misfer. Thank you for respecting the time limit. And thank you for this very informative intervention. Dr. Mohammed Al-Misfer has spoken about the role of the United States in various wars, from the war on Afghanistan until the recent coalition or alliance against ISIL. And Dr. Mohammed Al-Misfer said that the GCC countries had to play a role in all of these wars because, in fact, their role was to finance and bankroll these wars. So he posed a question: is this in the interest of the GCC countries? Is this a matter of choice, or do they have to do these things? He alluded to some of the aims and objectives behind the wars that the United States launches, which is first of all to establish sectarianism, secondly to impose American hegemony on the area, and also try and create the impression that America will protect people from ISIL, and finally to weaken them and drain their financial resources. Dr. Mohammed Al-Misfer has suggested a few things in order to immunize Gulf countries against these threats, like to start political reform, to also deal with the root causes of why these extremist groups occur, and to liberate our countries from American hegemony. Now we will have our next speaker, Dr. Abdullah Baabood, who will be talking about the consequences of the divisions and differences between GCC countries and the impact of that on the rise of ISIL. Dr. Baabood is the director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University, and he was associated with Cambridge University in Britain. He has an MA and a PhD from Britain. Please, Dr. Baabood, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Dr. Zoheir. It's very difficult to take the floor after such a distinguished professor like Dr. Mohammed al-Misfer, and the many different themes he has talked about. The differences between Gulf countries is nothing new for people who follow events in this part of the world. For many years now, we have seen how Gulf countries used to differ between themselves. Every now and then disputes occurred, but usually these differences would be sorted out through the normal procedures of quiet diplomacy, dialogue, and the avoidance of resorting to the media, and many differences in the past have been dealt with in this manner, and the GCC managed to continue its march, although it has been subjected to many severe problems in its history. The current difference or dispute is different, though, for many reasons. Timing and the way it has been dealt with, and this is the first time in the history of the GCC we see three GCC countries announce publicly for everybody to see and to know that they are recalling their ambassadors from GCC capital. This is not an easy issue that should not be ignored, because the GCC countries managed to protect themselves throughout the years despite the upheavals in this part of the world. The GCC countries did not stop there, recalling the ambassadors. They allowed this dispute to find its way to the media, and which turned it into a dispute, and not between leaders and political leaders. It became a problem and a dispute between the people too, and anybody who follows the social media will know, and to very low depths this dispute has sunk into between countries and peoples who are supposed to be brothers and families, in fact, tribes who have more than one bond between them, not just blood relations, but mutual history and future, etc. The way this dispute has been managed, and when it found its way to public arena in a manner which everybody is familiar with now, makes one wonder if, for example, the next GCC summit is to be held in Doha. How can that be possible when three out of the six membership states have no ambassadors here? This dispute comes at a time when the Arab region in general and the Middle East is engulfed by many crises. We do not really need to have someone to guide us through this map, this intricate web of disputes and crises. The entire area is ignited, it seems, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and also there is instability in many countries, Egypt and many other Arab countries. This, of course, in addition to the Arab-Israeli conflict and the recent aggression against the Gaza Strip. In view of these challenges and in view of what we see of Iranian policies towards this area and the Iranian nuclear issue and the intervention by regional and international powers, we find that the GCC countries, rather than closing ranks and joining forces to protect themselves, instead they have all these disputes, which makes any sane people wondering what on earth is all of this about at a time when we're in dire need of closing ranks. There is this kind of disarray. This is explained by some as a direct result of the Arab Revolution, which was like a storm which created a lot of change, and this led to some confusion on the part of the GCC countries. They didn't know what to do vis-a-vis this situation. Some called for the expansion of the GCC to include Jordan and Morocco. When we were just about to absorb and understand what was happening and the idea of enlarging the alliance to join these countries, suddenly we hear that they were offered money to withdraw these applications, as it were. Then instead of cooperation, we find some talk of unification, and this is, as an idea, this is excellent, of course, it's very welcome. Nobody denies that there is strength in numbers and in unity, but do we have on the ground all the necessary components for this kind of union or unity, which it seems neither the leadership, the political leadership, nor the people seem to accept, because there are many defects. Until now, the GCC Council, despite all this compatibility between the peoples and the countries, the GCC could not manage to have one, for example, coordinated and united foreign policy. Okay, some say that even the European Union, and after this long march towards unity and integration, they still have differences in their foreign policies. So we cannot simply jump over all of these obstacles and become one bloc with one joint foreign policy and joint defense policy at a time when much simpler aspects of cooperation are not there on the ground yet. For example, the common market or customs union and others, nothing of that has been achieved, and the basic interests of people are not united. So how can we jump over and leap over all of that to create one unified country? But despite the initial confusion, the GCC countries regain the initiative. Now they're starting a counter-revolution against the Arab Revolution, and what is happening in Egypt is amply clear, and how we want to bring the clock backwards in Egypt. What the coup that happened in Egypt to had the blessing of the GCC countries. The support by the GCC countries for the coup proves that even what's happening in Tunisia and Libya and other countries proves this point. Instead of the GCC countries benefiting from the Arab revolutions and to appreciate the fact that they've come to the people wanted to rid themselves of oppressive regimes, and rather than helping this youth, this deprived youth, and instead of helping these countries which are going through a transition period with economic and financial help, instead we find the Gulf countries doing exactly the opposite. They're trying to restore the former regimes in a way which is like attempting to make the clock go backwards. This is very dangerous undertaking, and we see that the GCC countries have not benefited at all from the Arab revolutions to create the kind of real and genuine reform inside these countries. GCC countries, like any other country, they need development, they need political reform, they need economic reform. In fact, the GCC countries had a tremendous opportunity to do that, and at the same time extend a hand of help to enhance stability in other countries, especially in view of the fact that after 2003, these countries became like the center of gravity for the Arab world, when the traditional countries like Egypt and Syria were going through the crisis that we all know about. When it comes to the political and economic weight of the GCC countries, this has become very important because of the surplus they find financially, which is in billions of dollars, in sovereign funds and others. The GCC countries could have benefited enormously from these funds to create a political, social, economic renaissance and development. Instead, we see that these funds are being squandered on projects aimed at taking the area backwards, and all of this happens at a time when the disputes between the GCC countries, at a time when the entire area is ignited with problems. The GCC countries represent the only hope of any political grouping. We find the League of Arab States is rendered hopeless and helpless. The Magharibi Union has passed away almost, or dying, if not dead already, and other political blocs are more or less suffering the same fate. So therefore, the GCC is the only hope, but even so, because of these disputes, even the GCC is being shaken to the foundations today. We cannot deny, of course, there is international and regional forces which are interfering, but the question remains, what can we do? What can we in the GCC countries do to counter this intervention? The Gulf countries try to contain Iran and minimize its threat. Okay, they tried that. What's happening now? Now we see what was described once as the Shiite crescent or arch is turning into a complete circle encompassing the Gulf and other countries. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, all of them are under Iranian control. Is this the kind of damage limitation you exercise? Is this what your efforts have resulted in? Isn't there any other way of dealing with Iran as a neighbor which has its rights, interests, and we deal with them on the basis of trust, or we leave them to their own devices, and at a time when do not have the means and the ability, we failed in all of this, and now is Iran is engulfing us from all directions, our countries, and we cannot do anything. Even the Western countries, when these are the same countries, by the way, that the GCC countries relied on, they are running from all directions to Tehran to talk to them and to make deals with them and to have political and economic relations with them. Our allies are tired from us, really. America and the Western countries now are feeling, I don't know, they seem to resent us now. Our policies are not coordinated, they are confused. We cannot work together, we cannot come up with a coordinated policy on the basis of coordination and cooperation. We stand against our own peoples and the peoples in other Arab countries. We disagree all the time. We are in a state of disarray. Our allies are avoiding us. They are running away from us. We find the United States every now and then sending us messages to the effect that they are going to depart this area and turn eastwards. We, on the one hand, blame America for intervening, and at the same time, we beg them to stay and to keep on interfering, and we want to encourage them by buying weapons from them. This kind of contradiction and confusion has confused our allies too. Now the Western countries are running to Iran because they are fed up from GCC countries who could not create a unified regional force which can contribute to the stability of the area. On the contrary, the GCC countries trying in their confusion, they contributed to the rekindling of this wave of extremism in the area. And here we are now, faced with this wave of extremism, which is trying to destabilize the entire area, including the Gulf country. I respect Dr. Mohammed al-Misfer, but I beg to differ on what he said. I think the GCC is also threatened. We should not remember what Al-Qaeda has done and we have done. And the same lesson applies to the ISIL and what it can do. I think I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for the intervention. It was very precise and very frank. Thank you for that. Dr. Abdullah Baabood, in a nutshell, shed light on the roots of Gulf tensions. Some, in his opinion, are primary causes and others are of secondary importance. He mentioned also these tensions recently between Qatar and the Gulf states. He said that for the first time it surfaces really in the media, whether local or global, and actually it moved from mere tensions between the regimes to sometimes tensions on the level of the peoples. Dr. Abdullah Baabood said also that among these reasons of tension and crisis, there is the foreign affairs policy, and he said that it doesn't mean that we all Gulf states should agree on one foreign policy like the EU, because in the EU these agendas differ depending on the member states. Dr. Abdullah Baabood also alluded to the role of some Gulf states when it comes to the counter-revolution. He said that this might be putting at risk the GCC states. It would have been beneficial for these states to benefit from the Arab Spring and its revolution through starting reform processes in these states. He also underscored the need of development, sustainable development, from a regional and Arab perspective. Dr. Baabood mentioned a very important point as well while discussing these tensions in the Gulf region. He said that the GCC countries try to belittle or to contain the role of Iran in the region, except that results on the ground were simply the opposite. There was an attempt to reduce the influence of this regional player, but he's asking the question, when we try to really corner Iran to reduce its role, is this wise and sound? Finally, he said that the emergence of Iran and the increase of its role, while the role of Arabs is weakening by the day, this led to even the allies of the region feeling resentment and reviewing their calculations when it comes to the relationship with the GCC states, and probably getting closer to the Iranian side. Thank you, Dr. Baabood. It was a pleasure to hear from you. And now we give the floor to Mr. Alain Gresh, who's a journalist and international rights activist. He's a member of the editorial board of France's Maghreb Levant newspaper. He's also the Secretary General of the French Association of Journalists of the Maghreb. Since 2005, he was the editor of Le Monde Diplomatique, and he was also the Director General of the same paper. Of course, among his publications, the Defining Palestine, actually. And today he is going to be talking about Saudi policy, Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. He has the floor. Thank you. I wrote my paper in English, but I'm going to be speaking in Arabic. And second, I changed the title of this paper. KSA between Iran and ISIL. This is the new title of the paper. If we were to summarize the Saudi policy for the last 10 years, we can summarize it in 2 words: fear and incapacity. Fear from Iran and incapacity because of numerous reasons, including domestic policy in KSA, and I'll go back to this point. Fear, obviously, from Iran. There is a major sensitivity in Iran, in KSA, since 2003. because in their opinion, there is an Iranian danger. It started after 2003. We know very well that Saudi Arabia was, of course, they were against Saddam Hussein, but they believed that this change of regime actually put power in the hands of Shiites. And then the Arab Spring happened. We know how that impacted Syria and the Iranian interference there, also in Lebanon nowadays. So there is a feeling that Saudi Arabia is actually surrounded with enemies, the majority of which actually are impacted greatly by Iran, and they have very close ties with Iran. So this is a vital conflict, and a clear position is required. So it's either you're with us or against us. This is, of course, what Bush said in his war against terror. The problem is that crises here in the Arab world have a geopolitical dimension in view of foreign policy of the US, Turkey, Iran, but there is also there are also specificities, I would say. We feel that Saudi Arabia does not take into consideration the specificities or the domestic problems of every country, and thinks that every country that does not support its position when it comes to the Arab Spring or of the events in the Arab region, it is actually standing against KSA. This is something we felt when it came to the tensions within the GCC, and also the ties between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and also actually the ties between Saudi Arabia and Turkey. This means that even Turkey, Saudi Arabia and Qatar would agree, for example, on the Syria dossier, when Qatar and Turkey took a different position on Egypt, for example, this led to major tensions with KSA. I'll go back to these tensions between Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood, but I think that, again, it's very important. Saudi Arabia feels that it is surrounded with dangers from all over the place. We also mention here a very important point. It's the relationship between the kingdom and certain extremist groups such as Qaeda or ISIL. The problem with the Saudi policy is a contradiction between the religious and the ideological beliefs in Saudi. It is the same ideology actually among Qaeda or ISIL. So between this ideology and the fact that these very groups are attacking now the kingdom and countries of the region. Let me take you back to the 1967 war, and also the changes that occurred in the region with the October War, and also the emergence of Saudi as a major player in the region. Since that time, Saudi Arabia started exporting to the Arab region, but also beyond the Arab region, to Muslims all over the world, some kind of an interpretation of Islam that is Salafist, I would say. Clearly, the term Salafist is very controversial, but let me allow it. So Saudis were exporting not only an ideology, but also tens of thousands of students who graduated from Saudi universities established after 67. Tens of thousands of students who came for Islamic studies and who eventually went back home. Saudi Arabia was also financing these movements that were Salafi currents, all over the world.
وكانوا بيفكروا ان في هذا الوقت يعني هذه التيارات معظمها كانت ممكن نقول تيارات غير سياسيه.
The majority of these currents were non-political.
السلفيه لم نتدخل.
And it was said that Salafist movements anyway would not interfere in politics or power and authority. That's why some Arabic governments would use these groups in order to fight the left-wing groups, for example, in Egypt, or against the Muslim Brotherhood. This is what we saw happen in Egypt under Mubarak. And this is when we saw a change between the Muslim Brotherhood and so here I'm talking specifically of the Salafist attitude of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is something that changed specifically in Egypt, but that's a whole other conversation and I'm not gonna dwell on it now. Until 2001, this policy didn't have any problems really. Saudi Arabia could have benefited from these Salafist groups. At the same time, something happened of importance in Afghanistan in the 90s when for the first time these Salafist movements started becoming political and jihadi. We know very well that Al-Qaeda saw the light really during the war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Until early 2000, Saudi Arabia was not aware of this danger coming from these groups, even after 9/11. I remember a visit to Saudi Arabia early 2002. I met a high-level official at the Ministry of Interior, and he said to me, we have no relation whatsoever with the group behind 9/11. You had not only one Saudi citizen and the 15 names that the Americans announced this is crap. They're not Saudis. Even all the way to 2003, when we started seeing some bombings here and there in Riyadh, the Saudi intelligence, of course the bombings targeted foreigners, Saudi intelligence arrested a number of foreigners. There was torture, and these people admitted the crimes, but Al-Qaeda was responsible. In other words, I'm trying to say that the Saudis were not aware that there's a possibility whatsoever that the groups attack Saudi Arabia. This changed completely in 2003 when Al-Qaeda attacked with the suicide bombers in 2003 to 2006. This is when the kingdom started paying attention to this factor and understanding that this Salafist jihadist movements are actually a danger not only for countries like Syria and Iraq, they're also a danger and a threat against the kingdom itself. I refer you also to what happened in Syria. Saudi Arabia knows that there are at least 14,000 fighting the 1400, excuse me, fighting against the regime, but the numbers vary. Sometimes they tell you 5,000 or 7,000, so the figures are not accurate. In Saudi Arabia, laws were enacted in order to fight terror. But when you say fighting terror in Saudi Arabia, it means by that fighting any position that might stand against the kingdom, including liberals or Muslim Brotherhood that are now considered as terrorists in Saudi Arabia, and also the jihadist movements. Still, there is contradiction when it comes to dealing with these groups. You know very well that the power of the ruling family stems from Islam and is based on Islam and on a number of Islamic scholars who play a very pivotal role in that matter.
الآن معظم الخطاب الإسلامي في المملكة
And the discourse in the kingdom
من هذا الخطاب والخطاب
is very much similar to the religious discourse used among jihadist movements, whether Al-Qaeda or ISIL.
ودي مشكلة كبيرة.
And this is a major problem.
أخذ قرارات حتى
The king took actually instructed the scholars to attack, in terms of positions, of course, these groups, and some of the scholars did do that. But let us ask the question here: even within Saudi Arabia, is this discourse way a lot? Is there a contradiction between this official discourse and the discourse of Muslim scholars in Saudi Arabia? A couple of days ago, there was a news item actually when it comes to the terrorists that were arrested in Saudi Arabia. It is said that 1,695 terrorists actually went to private schools in Saudi Arabia so that they cover themselves, so that they also cut their ties with terror, including 334 who joined terrorist groups after that. This was actually published even in Saudi media.
Rehabilitation قصده.
دي يكون مشكلة في نقطة تانية كنت عايز أعملها يعني وأظن مهمة.
Another point that I wanted to mention, I believe is important.
المملكة السعودية في
This is something I mentioned also in the beginning of my paper. It is the incapacity of KSA. I believe that KSA doesn't have an ideology. It is incapable of actually fighting the ideology of any enemy. When the crisis with Abdel Nasser started in the 50s and the 60s,
ما كانش في إمكانية السعوديين أن يكافحوا
هلكنا.
The Saudis have no ideological base to use when they want to fight an enemy. When they engaged in conflict with Nasser in the 60s, they did not have the ability to produce a discourse as such or any kind of cooperation with any other force. And this is the difference, a very important and fundamental difference between Iranian policy and the Saudi policy. The only discourse you're likely to get from pro-Saudi television or satellite television is Salafist in nature,
خطاب سلفي مش وزن
which carries no weight politically.
يعني والمملكة مش ممكن تعمل
And
حتى الآن
Saudi Arabia, until now, we have not seen
مع قوة غير
any real cooperation with a non-Islamic power. When you look at Iran, this is very different.
بتستعمل أوقات كتيرة يعني
The Iranians use the Shiite card, and they use many other cards for that matter. I mean, when we talk about their cooperation with the Syrian regime, which is Alawite, and some people say therefore it's Shiite or not. For example, they cooperate, they have relationship with some Christian groups in the Lebanon, with Islamic Jihad in Palestine. They have a political line of discourse,
سياسي
but the Saudi Arabia has no such thing. And finally, in conclusion, I can say that I visited Riyadh on different occasions and listened to lectures. And one famous Saudi journalist said, The problem is not the policy of Iran. The policy of Iran is very clear. We can understand that. The problem is the policy of Saudi Arabia, because nobody can understand what is the political direction of Saudi Arabia, especially in view of the fact that there is another dimension. Now, when you come to the leadership of Saudi Arabia, King Abdullah is 90 years of age. The heir apparent is 86. And the heir apparent, and the leadership is not able to produce a policy. Policy and politics mean compromising, means engaging in alliances, etc. So in this regard, Saudi Arabia lacks a great deal. Thank you very much. I'll try and give a brief summary of what you said. Mr. Gresh has talked about this Saudi Arabia's policy, or the lack of it, which can be understood in two aspects: the internal aspect and confronting Iran. He talked about the contradictions between the official religious ideology adopted by Saudi Arabia and its regional policy. Now we open the floor. Please be very brief. We are running out of time. We have 15 minutes only because we started late. So therefore we only have 15 minutes. Please be brief and make your questions of 1 minute in length maximum, no more. Thank you. Thank you. Abdul Khasro. We have no need to mention the papers. We benefited a great deal. They're very informative papers, but we're talking about ISIL in particular, and in addition to the military strategy and the tactics, they seem to be excel in. Rather, when it comes to the international relations and the conflicts in the Middle East, they seem to be exploiting any gaps. They try to drag both countries. Say, for example, if there is a conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for now they try to drag two countries into direct confrontation rather than the war by proxy that they engage in. The question is, can ISIL, Dr. Mohammed Misfer, this is a question for you and Dr. Abdullah Baabood, can ISIL exploit these differences in the GCC countries? And if that's a possibility, what can the GCC countries do to counter that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My question is to
Could you please introduce yourself, please?
This is Professor Blantaras from Turkey. My question is to Alain Gresh. You explained very well the Saudi, incapability of dealing with Iran, and it seems, amazing to me from looking at, Saudi perspective, severing the relations Turkey to this much. So Turkey is the only potential ally that can kind of at least balance Iranian influence in the geography. So do you think, a possible rapprochement between Turkey and Saudi Arabia?
Thank you.
Can the lady please use a microphone? We cannot hear her without a microphone. Why the GCC countries are not a target for the ISIL. If ISIL is fighting the regimes in power, like in Iraq and Syria, then maybe we can say that the GCCs are not, the GCC countries are not target. But if you study carefully Abu Bakr Baghdadi's discourse and what he talks about the establishment of the caliphate, then we're bound to think that he must try and make his way towards Mecca and threaten Saudi Arabia. And also, why are the GCC countries joining the international coalition? Is it because they are intimidated, frightened into doing that? Or do others want them only to finance and bankroll the operation? Or is it to get rid of what it's been speculated about, that the GCC countries financially helped the ISIL? So what is it out of all these possibilities? And finally, Mr. Gresh, in the absence of a Saudi policy, Saudi is still insisting on playing a major regional role. And I think the recalling of ambassadors is a reaction and a reflection of that, because they suddenly found someone competing with them. So where will Saudi lead themselves and the area into? Mohammed Abbas from the Arab Center. I think we need to focus on the internal threat to Saudi from ISIL, especially when many people are saying that there is a lot of support internally in Saudi Arabia for ISIL's ideology, and also Saudi attitude towards the Arab revolutions. And also this led to ending peaceful revolution and people turning into violence. The political now, the democratization process now, can it be only achieved through violence in that case, when the peaceful revolutions are put down? My question is to Mr. Alain Gresh. We can describe Saudi Arabia as the sick man of the area, and in the age of Ebola, can this virus from Saudi Arabia spread into other countries? And what will that be? The total collapse of the GCC if the Saudis lose their way like this? I'll take one more question, please. Dr. Haider. Thank you, Chair Haider Saeed from Iraq. It seems to me this session, at least for me personally, come closer to the idea that the Arab Spring as an attempt at reforming the area, regardless of the consequences, has created a very deep shock waves in the GCC countries, because they employed a certain number of now we're all suffering from the consequences of that. It seems to me eventually Arab Spring has touched the GCC countries at the very heart of this system, and what started as a difference in approach, now it seems to me the GCC countries trying to evade the central question of the necessity of reform in their countries, and they're not touching upon that at all. They're always trying to avoid that and talk about the outside threats. I'm not talking about an opinion here, an opinion there. Nobody seems to be tackling this question. Even phobia, Iran phobia, and ISIL phobia is an attempt to gloss over the real issue, which is threatening the core of the GCC countries. I'm sorry, I have to stop taking questions. Now I give each panelist 3 minutes for their concluding remarks. I'll start with Dr. Mohammed al-Misfer. Many things that need to be mentioned, but I'll be very brief. Al-Qaeda, all the Islamic movements, like Mr. Alain Gresh said, and Floor, Al-Qaeda organization, since its start, has never said anything about any political leadership in the GCC countries, except from the attempt, the life of His Highness Prince Mohammed bin Naif. And apart from that, no GCC leadership was subjected to any assassination attempt or anything. All the targeting was directed towards other foreign entities in the Gulf countries. So therefore, I repeat what I said earlier, that GCC is not threatened. And it's not at our borders. They're not approaching us. Between us and them, there is Iraq and Syria. What is even more threatening is Iran, because Iran is the immediate neighborhood. There is nothing more than 40 kilometers separating us. And what's happening in Yemen is a direct threat against the security of the GCC as states, peoples, resources. The other threat we are faced with, if the corruption continued and the prevalent political corruption continued, this will be another threat. The threat is from the inside and not from the outside. I'm saying ISIL is not a threat in the immediate future. And by and large, the GCC countries' approach and the way they've been dealing with ISIL and similar organizations is totally wrong. I don't have time to go into details. When I talked about Kissinger and others in my statement, these are think tanks which present studies to the administration. Our think tanks are nothing but just showcases. They sit there and only nominally try to do, and they in fact do nothing but fight the real think tanks who try to provide advice and opinion to the government. And also, nobody ever admitted or said that they financed ISIL. ISIL depends entirely on their internal sources. Please, lady, please let the speaker speak. What I'm saying, any financing ISIL may have received could not have been from any government source or official source, maybe from individuals, and what they managed to lay their hands on resources inside Iraq and Syria. As for the Saudi policy and the sick man of the Gulf, I think we are exaggerating here. Yes, the top of the pyramid of power suffers from the problem of aging. There are other generations in the ruling family. So if the decision does not come from the top, it can come from bottom. But this does not mean to say that there are no mistakes which are being committed. Thank you very much. Dr. Abdullah Baabood. In 3 minutes, please. I think the floor did not pose any direct question to me, maybe except for one, and that is the attitude of GCC countries towards the Arab Spring based on the fear of their fear from the Islamists. I say partly yes, and partly they fear from any real democratic change. If in Egypt or any other country the Arab Spring produced a democratic state through elections, the Gulf countries would immediately be accusing them of terrorism. The Muslim Brotherhood came to power through the ballot box, yet they accuse them of terrorism because they constitute a challenge, really, a tremendous challenge to the regimes in the area, because this threat or challenge is an ideological. The GCC countries present themselves as Islam-based rule. Here we find an Islamist organization ideology coming to power not through the traditional tribal system but through the ballot box. So this is a major challenge in their eyes. And also, what are these countries cannot accept change. They want to always impose the status quo because the status quo suits them more than anything. But this is against the grain of change and the movement of history. These people will always try and come back to get rid of these despotic regimes and impose their will and their rights. As for ISIL and the GCC countries, does the ISIL constitute a threat? Maybe to a certain extent, because there is a general void and vacuum ideologically. As some speakers said yesterday, since the collapse of the Islamic Caliphate in 1928, there is a void, there is no ideology. Once we had pan-Arabism, which we tried and they failed. Then there was leftist ideologies, and now ISIL and some Islamic movements, and it's been discovered that ISIL has a following in Kuwait, and Bahrain, and people have been arrested because of that. And finally, the regimes in the GCC countries throughout their history were a reason to have stability and peace in the area, but they have not developed to be more in line with the changes dictated by time and events. They still sometimes behave as if they're the product of the medieval ages. And if they want really to protect the kind of stability they created, they should really try and understand that what threatens their stability. Now the system itself is fighting itself. The differences between the very family of the GCC, they even went as far as personalizing issues, totally forgetting that there are people who want a better future, want security, want stability. We still suffer from border problems, we still suffer from tribal disputes, and these regimes who were the backbone of stability once could not develop themselves, and now they are suffering some internal diseases. Thank you, Dr. Baabood. Now we have Mr. Alain Gresh. 3 small observations. Once, about Saudi's relations with Turkey. You're right. When Saudi is thinking of countering the Muslim Brotherhood and Iran without allying itself with a proper power in the region, is indicative of the crisis the Saudi thinking is suffering from. And I think, secondly, there is financial support for ISIL, not officially, but maybe at the popular level, partly because the discourse they hear from ISIL is not that dissimilar to the official discourse. So if this kind of thinking, this kind of ideology is not confronted inside Gulf countries, they will have a problem. Thirdly, when it comes to the reform, I visit Saudi Arabia for the last 15, 20 years. When King Abdullah came, I thought there is the possibility of reform. In fact, he did something. Now I think that's finished. All Arab countries, 20 years into this is enough to prove that there is no possibility of real reform without the possibility of a big popular movement, like when we had Bashar in Syria, when Abdullah in Saudi, Abdullah in Jordan, and others. I think these governments are built on a foundation which is irredeemable. They're not compatible with real democracy, free and honest elections. Maybe they can be more open, less open. They can bring, like Morocco did, the Muslim Brotherhood to share power, but no real change. So therefore there is a crisis when it comes to revolutions and a crisis when it comes to reform. Thank you very much. Thank you. We come back to Dr. Mohammed al-Misfer for one last comment. Thank you. Very briefly, now Al-Qaeda and ISIL and all these similar organizations and Nusra and others, they are all terrorist organizations. I have no objection to that. But there is 17 Shiite armed militia and political groups from Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. They carry arms, they kill and slaughter every day. Their massacres are testimony to that. The mass graves are testimony to that. But the media in the Arab countries, in America and the West, say nothing about these people. Why the Sunnis are targeted? Why this injustice? Why should 18 political parties carry arms and fight their way through everywhere, but in our part of the world we're being slaughtered? This is a question, and a question to you, a question to the true and honest people who care for the welfare of the Arab and Muslim nations. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think this is an important point. And the reply to this, the question you raise, will determine the fate of Iraq, the political process, the fate of Syria, and many other issues. Thank you very much for all your contributions. We see you after the break. Thank you.